I'm happy. At 50 years old, I've spent years living out in the wild, trusting the honest silence of my animal friends far more than the calculated words of men. But occasionally, I visit the concrete jungles to observe my own species. Today, I'll tell you a story about a humble carpenter who walked into a luxury glass tower, only to be cruelly humiliated by an arrogant executive. What the executive didn't know was that this poor old man was the CEO's father. Where are you listening to this story from? Let me know in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel for more meaningful tales. The morning rain in Seattle, Washington, was a persistent, quiet drizzle that turned the city's towering glass facades into weeping mirrors. The air carried the faint, sharp scent of wet asphalt and expensive roasted coffee, the signature atmosphere of a metropolis that had completely traded its rugged, blue-collar logging history for the sterile, gleaming wealth of the modern tech boom. I am Wilder. At 55, I have spent the vast majority of my life breathing the unfiltered air of the deep, untamed wilderness, learning to trust the honest, brutal silence of animals far more than the manicured, calculated words of men. But occasionally, I venture into these vertical concrete jungles to observe my own species. I watch people in their natural, modern habitats, because it is in these highly constructed, artificial environments that the truest colors of the human soul are inevitably revealed. On this particular Tuesday morning, I was sitting unnoticed on a sleek leather sofa in the cavernous, aggressively modern lobby of Lumina Design, a premier architectural firm, watching the quiet collisions of human pride and corporate cruelty unfold. Through the massive revolving glass doors stepped a man who entirely defied the building's cold geometric perfection. His name was Arthur. Arthur was a 68-year-old retired master carpenter, a man seemingly built from the very oak and pine he had spent a lifetime shaping. He wore a faded red and black flannel shirt tucked neatly into sturdy canvas trousers, and a pair of heavily worn scuffed leather boots that had absorbed decades of sawdust and honest hard labor. Arthur's hands were thick, heavily calloused, and deeply lined a physical map of a modest, honorable life built entirely from scratch. He possessed a face weathered by years under the sun, yet it was framed by remarkably gentle, kind brown eyes that looked at the world without a single trace of cynicism. He had raised his only son single-handedly after his wife tragically passed away 2 decades ago, an event that, rather than hardening his heart, had only deepened his profound capacity for empathy and love. That son was William, the 35-year-old brilliant chief executive officer and lead architect of this very firm. Arthur had not come to ask for anything. He carried in his rough, scarred hands a small, meticulously hand-carved walnut pen box. He had spent 3 weeks in his small garage, sanding and polishing the wood until it felt exactly like silk, pouring every ounce of a father's devotion into the grain. It was a gift meant specifically for William on this exact day, the day his son's firm was slated to sign the most lucrative, monumental contract in its history. Standing under the dazzling multi-million-dollar modern chandelier, Arthur looked around the breathtaking lobby, his chest swelling with an overwhelming, quiet pride. He was a father simply standing in the physical manifestation of his son's monumental success. But a building is only as beautiful as the souls that inhabit it, and the internal soul of Lumina Design was currently fractured. Just 30 feet away from where Arthur stood, behind a sweeping reception desk, carved from imported white marble, stood Maya. Maya was 24 years old, a recent architecture graduate acting as a receptionist just to get her foot in the door of the highly competitive industry. She was a petite woman with dark, wildly curly hair pulled back into a severe professional bun, and large, observant eyes that usually sparkled with fierce ambition. She had grown up in a low-income, heavily industrialized neighborhood where green spaces were a luxury, a childhood reality that ignited her passionate, unyielding drive for sustainable, eco-friendly design. But this morning, her bright eyes were clouded with unshed tears and burning, suffocating humiliation. She was frantically reorganizing a stack of vendor files, her hands trembling slightly against the marble counter. The source of her trembling had just walked away, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. His name was Richard, the 40-year-old head of client relations. Richard was a man who wore his arrogance, exactly like he wore his expensive cologne, overpowering, aggressive, and impossible to ignore. He was tall, unnervingly lean, and dressed in a bespoke navy blue suit that likely cost more than Arthur's entire vintage truck. Richard had sharp, hawkish features, perfectly gelled hair that never moved, and a cold, calculating smile. He navigated the corporate world by assessing human beings purely by their net worth and the designer labels stitched into their clothes. To Richard, empathy was an unforgivable weakness, and anyone below his tax bracket was practically invisible. Just 5 minutes prior to Arthur's arrival, Maya had bravely stepped out of her designated lane and presented Richard with her meticulously drafted blueprints for an ecological community center. Hoping for a moment of mentorship, Richard hadn't even bothered to look at the complex structural math. He had pinched the rolled blueprints between his manicured fingers with extreme disgust, sneered at Maya's cheap, off-the-rack blazer, and dropped her life's dream directly into the silver wastebasket. He had leaned over the desk, his voice dripping with absolute, venomous condescension, and told her that her low-class, dirt-hugging thinking was entirely too inferior to ever belong in a high-end, elite firm like Lumina. He left her there, shattered and voiceless, a harsh, undeniable testament to the toxic, elitist culture he was actively cultivating on the floor, while the CEO was locked away in his corner office. Yet, in this sterile ecosystem of predators and prey, there was another silent observer besides myself. Sitting in a deeply shadowed corner of the expansive lobby, completely ignored by the frantic, sharply dressed staff, was an older man reading a financial newspaper. This was Mr. Sterling. To anyone walking by, he looked like an exhausted vagrant who had wandered inside just to escape the freezing Seattle rain. He wore a faded olive-green fishing jacket that smelled faintly of the sea, a frayed canvas bucket hat pulled low, and practical, heavily worn rubber-soled shoes. But Mr. Sterling was, in fact, an eccentric tech billionaire, the exact client Lumina Design was desperately hoping to sign later that afternoon. Having built his massive empire from absolute nothing, Sterling deeply despised corporate facades and superficiality. He had deliberately arrived 3 hours early, dressed like an old dock worker, to silently evaluate the true, unfiltered character of the firm before handing over his fortune. He sat perfectly still in the plush leather chair, his sharp, calculating eyes tracking absolutely everything from behind the folded edge of his newspaper. He had seen Richard's effortless cruelty. He had seen Maya's silent, heartbreaking tears as she picked her blueprints out of the trash. And now, he watched the old, calloused carpenter in the faded flannel shirt stand proudly in the center of the gleaming room, holding a simple walnut box, completely unaware of the corporate venom swirling around him. The stage was set, the players were all in motion, and the true test of this glass tower's foundation was about to begin. Chapter 2. The collision in the lobby. I remained perfectly still on the perimeter of the lobby, my complimentary espresso growing cold in its porcelain cup, as the inevitable collision of two entirely different worlds began to materialize. Arthur, holding his meticulously carved walnut box with the reverence of a man carrying a sacred relic, navigated the vast, intimidating expanse of the imported Italian marble floor. His scuffed, heavy leather boots made a soft, rhythmic thud against the polished stone, a sound completely alien to this temple of high-end corporate architecture. He approached the sweeping, crescent-shaped reception desk, offering a warm, crinkling smile to the young woman behind it. Maya hastily wiped a stray tear from the corner of her eye, desperately trying to mask the suffocating humiliation she had just endured. She forced a polite, trembling smile, opening her mouth to greet the elderly carpenter. However, before a single syllable could leave her lips, the sterile air was violently cut by the aggressive, overpowering scent of expensive bergamot cologne. Richard, the head of client relations, had just emerged from the adjacent glass-walled conference room. He was walking briskly toward the private executive elevators, his bespoke navy blue suit catching the light, looking every bit the ruthless corporate apex predator. But as his cold eyes swept across the lobby, They locked onto Arthur. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. His sharp, hawkish features immediately contorted into a mask of supreme, undisguised disgust. He looked at Arthur's faded red and black flannel shirt, noting the microscopic flecks of pale sawdust clinging to the fabric, and his gaze slowly drifted down to the worn, scuffed leather boots that dared to tread upon his immaculate floor. To Richard, Arthur was not a human being. He was an aesthetic violation, a walking insult to the multi-million-dollar brand image of Lumina Design. Without a second thought, Richard violently altered his trajectory, striding directly toward the reception desk and intentionally physically intercepting the old man. He stepped directly into Arthur's personal space, crossing his arms over his chest like a hostile barricade. "Excuse me," Richard snapped, his voice sharp and carrying a highly polished, theatrical superiority that echoed slightly in the cavernous lobby. "I believe you have taken a profoundly wrong turn, old man. The freight elevator and the service alley for courier deliveries are located around the back of the building, next to the dumpsters." Richard paused, letting his cold eyes rake up and down Arthur's humble attire one more time, a slow, calculated appraisal meant to make the carpenter feel painfully small. "And if you aren't holding a package, then I suggest you take your panhandling elsewhere. This is a premium architectural firm, not a charity shelter. We do not tolerate beggars loitering in our lobby." Arthur did not flinch. Most men in his position would have immediately flushed with red-hot anger, raised their voices, or shrunk away in shame. But Arthur was a man who had spent decades wrestling raw timber into beautiful shapes. He possessed an infinite reserve of quiet, unshakable patience. He simply adjusted his grip on the smooth walnut box and looked Richard directly in the eyes. "Good morning to you too, sir," Arthur replied, his voice carrying a deep, gravelly warmth that refused to be intimidated by the expensive suit standing before him. "I assure you, I am not here to make a delivery, nor am I asking for any handouts. I am here to see William. If you could kindly point me toward his office, I would be entirely out of your way." For a fraction of a second, Richard simply stared at the old man, his brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of the request. And then, Richard let out a loud, sharp, barking laugh. It was a cruel, echoing sound that drew the attention of several junior designers passing by, intentionally designed to maximize Arthur's public humiliation. "William?" Richard mocked, his voice dripping with absolute, venomous condescension as he leaned closer to the elderly man. "You casually walk into the most elite design firm on the West Coast, tracking dirt on a floor that costs more than your life insurance policy, and you ask for William. Listen to me very carefully, you pathetic old fool. The man you are referring to is the chief executive officer and the visionary lead architect of this entire company. He is currently preparing to sign a historic contract that will redefine this city's skyline. A man of your obvious societal standing does not have the right, nor the privilege, to use his first name." Richard took a threatening half-step forward, his perfectly gelled head tilting downward. "I am the head of client relations, and I am the gatekeeper of this establishment. You will turn around right now, and you will walk out those revolving glass doors before you permanently pollute the air of this high-end space. Leave. Immediately." Behind the reception desk, the agonizing exchange hit Maya like a physical blow to the stomach. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped the marble counter, her fingernails biting painfully into her palms. Her chest heaved with a sickening mixture of rage and grief. Looking at Arthur's gentle, weathered face and his humble flannel shirt, she did not see a trespassing beggar. She saw her own father. Her father, Tomas, was a retired shipyard welder, a broad-shouldered, exhausted man with the exact same calloused hands and the exact same quiet dignity. A man who had literally broken his back in the suffocating hulls of cargo ships to pay for her architecture degree. She knew the brutal, agonizing reality of men like Arthur and Tomas. They were the invisible backbone of the world, the men who physically built the glass towers that arrogant executives like Richard so proudly paraded in. Watching Richard ruthlessly degrade this kind-hearted old man just after having her own dreams trashed was pushing Maya dangerously close to a breaking point. And she was not the only one deeply disturbed by the display. In the dimly lit, plush seating area on the far side of the lobby, the rustling sound of paper quietly ceased. Mr. Sterling, the eccentric tech billionaire masquerading as a vagrant fisherman, slowly lowered his financial newspaper. Underneath the brim of his frayed canvas bucket hat, his sharp, predatory eyes locked entirely onto Richard's back. The passive, quiet observation of the morning had instantly evaporated. Sterling's gaze turned terrifyingly cold, the calculating, lethal look of a powerful titan who had just identified a catastrophic, rotting liability within an investment. He sat perfectly still, his weathered hands resting on his knees, silently waiting to see just how far this toxic arrogance would go. Chapter 3: Compassion and the Threat. From my quiet vantage point in the corner of the lobby, I watched the fragile veneer of corporate civility completely disintegrate. Arthur's polite but unyielding refusal to be intimidated acted like gasoline poured directly onto the raging, unstable fire of Richard's fragile ego. In Richard's heavily manicured world, people of Arthur's visible socio-economic status were supposed to bow their heads, apologize for their mere existence, and scurry away into the shadows. The fact that this dusty, flannel-wearing carpenter dared to hold his ground and speak to him as an equal was not just an annoyance, it was an unforgivable insult. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson, the veins in his neck bulging slightly against his stiff white collar. He had entirely lost his patience. Without another word to the old man, Richard aggressively unclipped the sleek black two-way radio from his belt, his manicured thumb pressing the transmit button with unnecessary force. He barked a sharp, frantic order into the device, demanding that building security report to the front desk immediately to remove a hostile, trespassing vagrant from the premises. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy doors near the elevator bank swung open, and Marcus stepped into the lobby. Marcus was the daytime security supervisor, a 52-year-old former city beat cop. He was a massive, burly man built like a cinder block wall, wearing a tight, gray Lumina-designed security uniform that stretched over his broad chest. Despite his intimidating physical size, Marcus possessed the heavy, exhausted posture and the deep, dark under-eye bags of a working-class man pulling double shifts to put his 3 children through state college. He was not an inherently cruel man, nor did he enjoy throwing people out into the rain, but he was a tired employee trapped in a system where obeying the ruthless head of client relations was the only way to protect his pension. Marcus jogged heavily toward the reception area, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt, fully expecting a violent confrontation based on Richard's frantic radio call. Behind the sweeping marble reception desk, Maya felt the air completely leave her lungs. The sight of the burly security guard approaching this gentle, harmless old man shattered the last remnants of her corporate paralysis. For 4 agonizing months, she had swallowed her pride, endured Richard's relentless verbal abuse, and watched him systematically mistreat everyone he deemed beneath him, all because she was terrified of losing her desperately needed paycheck. But as she looked at Arthur, standing there with his quiet dignity, clutching the handmade walnut box as if it held his very heart, the paralyzing fear suddenly evaporated. The memory of her own father's calloused hands overlapping with Arthur's was too powerful to ignore. The moral compass that had guided her entire life, the very empathy that drove her to design ecological spaces for marginalized communities, screamed at her to act. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Maya abandoned her organized stacks of vendor files. She stepped out from behind the protective marble barricade of the reception desk, her low-heeled shoes clicking decisively against the floor. Richard noticed her movement immediately. He turned his head, his cold eyes narrowing into venomous slits. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Maya?" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a low, highly dangerous whisper meant only for her. He stepped subtly into her path, his posture radiating pure intimidation. "If you take one more step toward this vagrant, you will never set foot in an architectural firm in this city again. I will personally see to it that your career is dead before it even begins. Get back behind that desk." Maya stopped for a fraction of a second, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The threat was incredibly real, Richard had the power and the malice to blackball her from the industry. But she looked past his expensive suit, directly at Arthur, who was watching her with a remarkably calm, understanding expression. Maya lifted her chin, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden fierce defiance that completely caught Richard off guard. She completely ignored her tyrannical boss, sidestepping him with graceful determination, and walked directly to the elderly carpenter. "Sir, please, come with me," Maya said, her voice remarkably steady and incredibly gentle. She did not grab him or treat him like a nuisance. Instead, she offered her hand, lightly touching Arthur's rough, flannel-clad arm to guide him away from Richard and the approaching security guard. She led the old man to the most luxurious plush leather sofa in the center of the lobby, gesturing for him to sit down and rest. Leaving him for only a brief moment, Maya rushed over to the sleek, complimentary hospitality station. She bypassed the espresso machine, carefully pouring a glass of warm, filtered water, and brought it back to Arthur, holding it out to him with both hands. "I am so deeply sorry for how you are being treated," Maya whispered, her voice thick with genuine emotion, bowing her head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "You do not deserve to be spoken to that way. Please, drink this and rest for a moment. It's cold outside." Arthur took the glass with his scarred, calloused hands, his eyes widening in mild, pleasant surprise at the young woman's extraordinary bravery. He took a slow sip of the warm water, letting the comfort of the gesture wash over him. He looked up at Maya, his sharp, weathered eyes taking in her cheap, off-the-rack blazer, her nervously clenched hands, and the faint, permanent graphite smudges on her fingertips that marked a true, passionate drafter. Arthur smiled, a beautiful, radiant expression that completely transformed his lined face, bringing a sudden warmth to the sterile, heavily air-conditioned room. "Thank you, my child," Arthur said, his gravelly voice filled with absolute, unconditional kindness. He reached out and gently tapped the side of the exquisite walnut box he was holding. "You know, anyone can learn how to draw straight lines, calculate weight loads, or arrange expensive glass panels, but a building without a soul is just a beautiful cage. You have a brave, beautiful soul, and in my experience, that is the single most important foundation of a truly great architect. Do not ever let arrogant men convince you otherwise." Maya's breath hitched, a single hot tear finally breaking free and rolling down her cheek. The words were a profound, healing balm to the devastating wound Richard had inflicted on her just moments ago when he threw her life's work into the trash. But the beautiful, quiet moment of human connection was instantly violently shattered. Richard had followed them, his face now completely contorted with a rage so intense he was practically vibrating. His absolute authority had been publicly undermined by a mere receptionist, a humiliation his narcissistic mind could not process. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Richard screamed, his voice no longer composed or polished, but echoing shrilly off the high glass ceilings. Several employees stopped dead in their tracks, turning to stare in shock. Marcus, the security guard, paused his approach, unsure of how to handle the erupting executive. Richard pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Maya's face. "You are fired, effective immediately. You are officially terminated for gross insubordination. Pack up whatever pathetic, worthless trash you have at that desk and get out of my building right now. You are nothing but a low-class nobody, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life pouring coffee." As Richard's tyrannical screaming filled the lobby, the atmosphere grew incredibly tense, the very air feeling heavy with impending disaster. Yet, amidst the chaos, my eyes drifted back to the shadowed corner of the room. Mr. Sterling had not moved a single muscle during the screaming match. He was still sitting in his plush chair, his faded canvas bucket hat pulled low, but the financial newspaper was now completely discarded on the table beside him. Slowly, the eccentric billionaire reached into the deep pocket of his weathered fishing jacket and pulled out a simple, rugged smartphone. His sharp eyes flicked from the incredibly brave, tearful receptionist to the red-faced, screaming head of client relations, having seen exactly all he needed to see. With a remarkably calm, calculated precision, Mr. Sterling's thumb tapped out a short, decisive text message, hitting send to an unknown recipient, silently sealing the fate of the people in the room before the real storm even arrived. Chapter 4. Dad. The echoes of Richard's tyrannical screaming were still bouncing off the acoustic glass panels of the vast lobby when the situation threatened to turn physical. Following Richard's relentless, high-decibel orders, Marcus finally took a heavy, reluctant step forward. He was joined by a second security officer, who had sprinted over from the East Wing, a young man named Dave. Dave was in his early 20s, possessing a military-style buzz cut, a nervous twitch in his jaw, and a gray Lumina design uniform that hung a little too loosely on his thin, wiry frame. He was a rookie, entirely intimidated by the corporate hierarchy, and desperate to prove his worth in his first month on the job. Under Richard's venomous glare, Dave and Marcus flanked the plush leather sofa, reaching their hands out to forcefully grab Arthur's flannel-clad arms and physically drag the elderly carpenter out into the unforgiving Seattle rain. Maya, trembling but completely resolute, stepped directly in front of them, using her petite body as a human shield to protect the gentle old man holding the walnut box. The air in the room was stretched so tight it felt as though it might violently snap. And then, a sound cut through the suffocating tension. It was a soft, melodious, and highly distinctive ding. Unlike the standard elevators used by the general staff, this sound came from the private, biometric-secured executive elevator located at the far end of the marble lobby. The heavy, brushed steel doors silently slid open, revealing the chief executive officer of Lumina Design. This was William. At 35 years old, William was a striking, formidable figure who commanded absolute attention the moment he entered a room. He had inherited his father's broad, sturdy shoulders and his deeply empathetic, intelligent brown eyes, but those physical traits were currently wrapped in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored slate-gray suit that spoke of immense, untouchable wealth. He wore no tie, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, giving him the aura of a creative genius who was perpetually in motion. William was a man who had built this architectural empire from nothing, fueled entirely by the relentless, blue-collar work ethic he had watched his father display in a dusty carpentry garage for decades. Despite his soaring success, William had never lost his grounding. He was a leader who valued substance over style. But right now, the usually composed, highly calculating CEO looked visibly frantic. He was practically sprinting out of the elevator, his eyes scanning the massive lobby with desperate urgency. Arthur had called him on his private cell phone 15 minutes ago from the reception desk, but William had been trapped in a soundproof boardroom, desperately trying to finalize the legal paperwork for the impending Sterling contract. The moment he had seen the missed call, he had abandoned his executive board, racing down to greet the man he loved more than anyone else in the world. William's rapid, purposeful stride slowed as he absorbed the bizarre, highly chaotic scene unfolding in the center of his pristine lobby. He saw the junior staff frozen in shock. He saw Maya, his young receptionist, standing bravely in front of a sofa with tears streaking her face. He saw his head of client relations, Richard, red-faced and hyperventilating with rage, aggressively directing 2 security guards to remove someone. And then, William's frantic gaze shifted past the guards. He saw the faded red and black flannel shirt. He saw the scuffed, sawdust-stained leather boots. He saw the beautiful, meticulously hand-carved walnut box resting in the calloused hands of the man sitting on the sofa. "Dad!" The single word erupted from William's chest, carrying a raw, unpolished, and boyish desperation that echoed like a thunderclap across the cavernous million-dollar space. It was not the voice of a billionaire CEO addressing a subordinate. It was the voice of a son who had just realized his father was under attack. The acoustic impact of that single syllable was absolutely devastating. It hit the room with the force of a physical shockwave, freezing every single person in their exact tracks. Marcus and Dave, the two security guards, instantly yanked their hands back as if the flannel fabric on Arthur's arms had suddenly caught fire. Dave's jaw dropped open, his nervous twitch entirely vanishing into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. They stumbled backward, bumping into each other in their desperate haste to put distance between themselves and the elderly man they had just been ordered to assault. But the most catastrophic physical transformation belonged entirely to Richard. When the word "Dad" echoed through the lobby and registered in Richard's highly calculating brain, the arrogant, predatory executive simply stopped functioning. The dark, mottled crimson of his rage vanished in a millisecond, rapidly replaced by a sickly, translucent pallor that made him look like a reanimated corpse. The blood entirely drained from his face, leaving his sharp, hawkish features looking gaunt and terrified. His perfectly tailored navy blue suit suddenly seemed far too large for him. Richard's knees actually buckled, a visible, violent tremor shooting down his long legs as the catastrophic weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He swayed on his expensive Italian leather shoes, entirely unable to support his own weight, forced to reach out and grip the edge of a nearby marble display pedestal just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His mind raced in agonizing, terrifying circles. He had just brutally humiliated, mocked, and attempted to physically eject a man he had deemed a worthless, low-class vagrant. He had insulted the man's clothes, laughed at his request, and tried to throw him into the street. And that man was the creator, the father, the very lifeblood of the CEO who held Richard's entire existence, career, and future in the palm of his hand. Richard's arrogant, elitist facade was completely, irreparably shattered, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, hollow shell of a man who knew he had just committed professional suicide. Absolute, deafening silence descended upon the vast lobby of Lumina Design. Not a single phone rang. Not a single employee dared to breathe. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic patter of the Seattle rain hitting the massive glass windows outside. Amidst this terrifying, paralyzed silence, motion finally returned to the shadowed corner of the room. Mr. Sterling, the eccentric billionaire hidden beneath the guise of a weathered fisherman, allowed a slow, highly satisfied smile to stretch across his face. He had meticulously orchestrated his early arrival to uncover the true nature of this firm, and the spectacular implosion he had just witnessed was more revealing than 1,000 corporate audits. Moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace that completely belied his elderly appearance, Mr. Sterling quietly folded his financial newspaper, tucking it neatly under his arm. He stood up from his plush leather chair, adjusting his frayed canvas bucket hat, and began a slow, measured walk toward the frozen crowd, fully prepared to watch the impending, glorious execution. Chapter 5. The Foundation of Respect. From my quiet vantage point, I watched as the suffocating tension in the lobby finally broke, not with a roar of executive fury, but with an act of profound, unrestrained love. William did not scream. He did not immediately unleash his wrath upon the terrified security guards or the paralyzed head of client relations. Instead, the formidable billionaire CEO completely ignored the corporate hierarchy surrounding him. He walked straight past Richard's trembling figure and dropped to his knees right in front of the plush leather sofa. William wrapped his arms around Arthur, burying his face in the rough, sawdust-scented fabric of his father's faded flannel shirt. Arthur hugged him back fiercely, his heavily calloused hands gently patting his son's back, a deeply intimate gesture that rendered the millions of dollars of imported marble around them entirely insignificant. When William finally pulled back, Arthur smiled warmly and held out the meticulously hand-carved walnut box. With trembling fingers, William unlatched the small brass hinge. Inside lay a stunning, perfectly balanced wooden pen, the grain polished to a silken finish. It was a masterpiece of honest labor. William, a man who regularly negotiated 9-figure contracts without blinking, stared at the humble gift as a single heavy tear broke free, rolling down his cheek to splash onto his tailored slate gray suit. It was a breathtaking reminder of the exact roots that had nurtured his towering success. The beautiful, emotional reunion lasted only a moment before the loving sun retreated, and the CEO of Lumina Design returned to the surface. William carefully closed the walnut box, holding it tightly against his chest as he slowly stood up. When he turned around, his deeply empathetic brown eyes had hardened into chips of pure, frozen ice. He locked his gaze onto Richard. The head of client relations was sweating profusely, his previous aura of arrogant invincibility entirely shattered. Richard instinctively took a step back, his hands raising in a pathetic, trembling gesture of defense. "William, sir, please," Richard stammered, his highly polished voice cracking into a desperate, high-pitched whine. He frantically tried to smooth his bespoke navy blue suit, though his hands were shaking violently. "It is a complete misunderstanding, I swear to you. He didn't state his identity properly. I was merely enforcing the building's strict security protocols. We have a premium brand image to maintain, and I was just trying to protect the firm from vagrants. You have to understand, I was doing this for the company." William's expression remained terrifyingly cold, completely unmoved by the frantic groveling. He took one measured step toward the trembling executive. "A great building constructed on a rotten, toxic foundation will eventually collapse, Richard," Williams said, his voice dangerously low, yet carrying perfectly across the dead silent lobby. "The foundation of a truly magnificent architectural firm is not made of Italian marble, imported glass, or expensive suits. It is built entirely on the fundamental respect we show to human beings. You have spent months poisoning my company with your elitist arrogance, mistreating the very people who physically build the dreams we design. And you just tried to throw the man who gave me my life out into the rain." William paused, letting the devastating weight of his words crush whatever remaining hope Richard clung to. "You are stripped of all your titles, your equity, and your authority, effective this exact second. You are fired, Richard. Do not ever speak to me, or anyone in this building, ever again." To ensure the execution of his order, William's eyes scanned the crowd of shocked onlookers and landed on Brenda. Brenda was the 48-year-old director of human resources. She was a tall, incredibly poised woman with iron-gray hair cut into a sharp, immaculate bob, and she wore severe rectangular glasses that framed her sharp, analytical eyes. Shaped by decades of navigating chaotic corporate mergers and managing massive layoffs, Brenda was known for her absolute, emotionless efficiency and strict adherence to protocol. She showed absolutely no sympathy for Richard's plight. "Brenda," William commanded cleanly, "escort him to his office. Give him exactly one cardboard box and 5 minutes to clear out his personal belongings. Then, have security march him out the back door." Brenda gave a sharp, professional nod, immediately stepping forward to flank the devastated former executive. Before Brenda could march Richard away, a new voice interrupted the proceedings. "A very wise, highly necessary decision, William." The crowd parted as Mr. Sterling, the eccentric billionaire, stepped out from the shadowed corner of the lobby. He slowly reached up and pulled off his frayed canvas bucket hat, revealing a head of neat, silver hair. The passive, exhausted vagrant persona completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the commanding, undeniable gravity of a self-made titan. William's eyes widened in genuine shock as he recognized the man he had been frantically preparing to meet in the upstairs boardroom. "Mr. Sterling," William breathed, entirely bewildered by the billionaire's presence and attire. "I prefer to evaluate my investments from the ground floor, William. The view from the top is far too heavily curated," Sterling explained, offering a small, knowing smile. He gestured casually toward the trembling, pale figure of Richard. "I have been sitting here for over an hour. I watched that man's sickening cruelty, and I was fully prepared to walk away from our partnership entirely. A company that employs predators is a liability I cannot afford." Sterling then turned his sharp, calculating gaze directly toward Maya, who was still standing protectively near Arthur, her dark eyes wide with shock. "However, I also witnessed something incredibly rare today. I watched a young receptionist, risk her entire livelihood to protect a stranger. She showed a profound level of courage and compassion. Sterling took a step closer to William, his tone turning absolute and non-negotiable. I am prepared to sign the mega contract with Lumina Design today, William. But I have one non-negotiable condition. My ecological community project will not be handled by your elite, soulless senior partners. It will be spearheaded by her. I want this young woman as the lead assistant architect on my account. She has the exact soul and the backbone my project desperately requires. Maya gasped audibly, her hands flying to cover her mouth as fresh tears of overwhelming shock flooded her eyes. Just 10 minutes ago, her blueprints had been thrown into the trash, and she had been brutally fired. Now, a billionaire was demanding her creative leadership. William looked at Maya, truly seeing her for the first time. He noticed the permanent graphite smudges on her fingers, the protective stance she still held near his father, and the sheer bravery it must have taken to stand up to a tyrant like Richard. A deep wave of guilt washed over the CEO. He walked over to the young woman and bowed his head slightly. Maya, I am profoundly, deeply sorry, William said, his voice echoing with genuine remorse. I was so blinded by the expansion of this firm that I completely neglected to manage the internal culture on the floor. I allowed a toxic man to thrive while brilliant, compassionate people like you suffered in silence. That changes today. William offered her a warm, highly respectful smile. If you are still willing to work here, you are officially promoted to junior architect, and you will be the lead assistant on Mr. Sterling's account, exactly as he requested. Maya nodded frantically, unable to form words, wiping her tears of pure joy as the entire lobby erupted into spontaneous, relieving applause. The only person not celebrating was Richard, guided forcefully by the emotionless, strict presence of Brenda and the two security guards. Richard was paraded back through the lobby a few minutes later. He was clutching a cheap, brown cardboard box filled with his framed degrees and expensive desk accessories. His bespoke navy blue suit seemed to hang lifelessly on his defeated frame. As he walked toward the exit, stripped of all his false superiority and arrogance, Richard kept his eyes glued firmly to the marble floor, enduring a walk of absolute, soul-crushing shame, cast out from the very glass tower he had believed he ruled. Chapter 6. The Unshakable Roots. Exactly 6 months had passed since the heavy, oppressive storm of arrogance was violently expelled from the soaring glass walls of Lumina Design, and as I observed the firm once again, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The suffocating clinical chill that once dictated the atmosphere of the grand lobby had entirely evaporated, replaced by a vibrant, collaborative warmth that seemed to breathe life into the very architecture of the building. The sweeping marble reception desk was no longer a barrier of intimidation. It had become an open, welcoming hub of creative exchange. To truly understand this profound cultural shift, one only needed to look at the newest addition to the team, Leo. Leo was a 21-year-old architectural intern, a tall, endearingly gangly young man with a mop of unruly blonde curls and thick, round tortoiseshell glasses that perpetually slid down the bridge of his nose. Having grown up on a struggling dairy farm in rural Oregon, Leo possessed a deep, inherent respect for the land, a trait that made him incredibly passionate but deeply anxious in this high-tech urban environment. On his very first day, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the firm, Leo had accidentally dropped a massive tray of expensive coffees, splashing dark liquid across the pristine floor and ruining several preliminary sketches. Under the old regime, Richard would have mercilessly fired him on the spot. Instead, a senior partner had simply laughed, handed Leo a stack of napkins, and spent the next 20 minutes helping the trembling intern redraw the ruined schematics. The toxic, elitist hierarchy had been completely dismantled, entirely erasing the cruel discrimination that once choked the creativity out of the lower-level staff. Lumina Design was no longer just a company that built structures. It was a community that actively built people. At the very heart of this flourishing new ecosystem was Maya. She was no longer the terrified, voiceless receptionist, hiding behind a cheap, off-the-rack blazer. Today, Maya stood confidently at the center of the firm's primary design studio, wearing a beautifully tailored, sustainable linen suit in a soft olive green. Her dark, wildly curly hair was left free, cascading over her shoulders as she leaned over a massive, state-of-the-art drafting table. Her fingertips still bore the faint, permanent smudges of graphite, the honorable mark of a true creator, but her eyes sparkled with an unyielding, joyful authority. She was now a highly respected junior architect, specifically hand-picked to serve as the lead designer for the Sterling Corporation's groundbreaking ecological community project. Maya was currently orchestrating a complex presentation involving integrated living walls, advanced solar glass paneling, and sustainable water recycling systems. Her innovative, dirt-hugging ideas, which had once been cruelly thrown into a silver wastebasket, were now the crowning jewel of the firm's portfolio. Dozens of senior architects and structural engineers stood around her drafting table, nodding in profound respect and taking diligent notes as she spoke. She had finally found a home where her brilliant mind and her compassionate soul were not just tolerated, but aggressively celebrated and nurtured. While Maya commanded the bustling creative floor below, an equally profound, yet intensely quiet moment was unfolding on the top floor of the tower. Inside the breathtaking glass-walled executive suite that overlooked the glittering Seattle skyline and the distant snow-capped peak of Mount Rainier, William sat behind his imposing desk. The desk itself was a marvel of modern design, a massive, flawless pane of custom-cut tempered glass resting on minimalist brushed steel legs. Sitting on the plush, leather guest chair directly opposite the CEO was Arthur. The elderly master carpenter looked entirely at peace in the multi-million-dollar environment. He was still dressed in his signature, humble attire, a freshly laundered, softly worn blue and gray flannel shirt and his sturdy leather boots. Arthur leaned back comfortably, cradling a porcelain cup of high-end, dark roast coffee in his heavily calloused hands, the steam curling into the air as a deeply proud, serene smile graced his weathered face. He wasn't looking at the magnificent view of the city. His gentle brown eyes were locked entirely onto his son. Resting on the pristine glass surface of William's desk was a towering stack of heavily vetted legal documents. It was the finalized, multi-billion-dollar contract with the Sterling Corporation, the single most important, monumental achievement of William's entire professional life. It was the contract that would officially cement Lumina Design as a global titan in the architectural world. A man of William's immense wealth and status would typically sign such a historic document with a gold-plated Mont Blanc or a diamond-encrusted fountain pen gifted by a corporate sponsor. Instead, William reached to the corner of his desk, where the meticulously hand-carved walnut box rested. He gently unlatched the small brass hinge and withdrew the wooden pen his father had made for him 6 months ago. The wood was polished to a silken finish, perfectly balanced, carrying the faint, comforting scent of raw timber and honest labor. William looked up, meeting his father's eyes. No words were spoken between them, because none were needed. The silent current of unconditional love and boundless gratitude said everything. William lowered his hand, pressing the tip of the wooden pen to the heavy parchment, and signed his name with a smooth, decisive flourish, officially securing the future of his empire. With the final signature complete, William let out a long, deeply contented breath. He did not put the pen back into the box immediately. Instead, he gently laid it down right in the center of the flawless, transparent glass desk. The visual contrast was absolute poetry. The cold, sterile, highly manufactured perfection of the modern glass was beautifully interrupted by the warm, rustic, sawdust-birthed reality of the wooden instrument. It was a profound, silent testament to the journey they had taken. The rustic wooden pen resting proudly on the luxurious glass desk stood as an eternal, unbreakable symbol. It was a permanent reminder to everyone who entered that office that no matter how high a person climbs, no matter how much wealth or power they accumulate in the glass towers of the world, they must never, ever forget their humble roots, and they must never abandon the fundamental, grounding grace of human kindness. The story of Arthur and William leaves us with a beautiful reminder that true wealth is never measured by the expensive clothes we wear or the glittering glass towers we walk into. It is measured by the deep respect and simple kindness we show to one another. In our busy daily lives, it is so easy to judge people by their outward appearance or to get completely lost in our own pursuit of success. We often forget that a single act of patience, a warm smile, or a moment of understanding can completely change someone else's day. True success is always remembering our koinguan, our roots, and treating every single person with dignity. If this story brought a little warmth and light to your day, please share it with your loved ones, your friends, and your family. Leave a comment below to let us know your personal thoughts on this journey. And please subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these meaningful stories with you. May God bless you and your family with abounding health, deep peace, and a heart full of compassion. May He always guide your steps in the daylight and surround you with people who truly see your true value. If you believe that kindness and respect are the most beautiful things a person can ever wear, please type Amen in the comments below.